Today's documentary, Chokepoint, the Strait of Hormuz Crisis of 2026. Every single day, 20 million barrels of oil pass through a strip of water just 33 kilometers wide. It sits between Iran and Oman, at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, and it is the single most important choke point in the global economy. On February 28, 2026, that choke point was shut down. Iran's Revolutionary Guard declared the Strait of Hormuz closed, and within hours, the world began to unravel. Oil prices surged past $118 a barrel. The Dow Jones plunged over 1,000 points. 700 tankers sat frozen outside the strait, carrying billions of dollars worth of crude, gas, and chemicals with nowhere to go. Maersk, the largest shipping company on Earth, insurance companies pulled coverage entirely. And in South Asia, where Pakistan gets 99% of its natural gas from the Gulf, governments began emergency rationing. This is not a hypothetical scenario, and what comes next could reshape the global economy for a generation. Picture that narrow channel on a map. It is a mere 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point. A frantic, sun-bleached highway flanked by the jagged brown mountains of Iran's southern coast and the smoother, more distant shores of Oman. The air here hums with the diesel roar of supertanker engines, and the water churns white in their wakes. For decades, it has been a place of relentless motion, a capillary through which the lifeblood of modern civilization flows. We all know its name, the Strait of Hormuz, but few truly comprehend the intricate machinery of dependency it powers. Every minute of every day, a vessel carrying oil or gas passes through. A metronome of global trade that has, until this moment, never truly stopped. To understand what happens when it does, you have to see the whole system. A delicate and interconnected web stretching from the arid deserts of the Arabian Peninsula to the neon-lit trading floors of Manhattan, and the darkened kitchens of Chokepoint. That system had a trigger. A single on the morning of February 28th, following a joint United States and Israeli military strike that killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. A statement was issued, aimed not from a government ministry, but from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the nation's most powerful military and economic force. The statement was terse and absolute. The Strait of Hormuz, it declared, the IRGC's naval arm, with its swarms of fast attack craft and its arsenal of anti-ship missiles dug into the cliffsides, moved to enforce the decree. The world held its breath, waiting to see if this was a symbolic gesture or a genuine blockade. The answer came within 24 hours, as satellite imagery from companies like Planet Labs and Maxar Technologies showed a growing, serpentine queue of vessels forming at either end of the strait. The flow of oil, which had been a steady 20 million barrels per day just a week before, plummeted by 86%. The queue grew to over 700 tankers. Each of those ships is a floating city of steel, carrying enough crude to power a small nation for a month. Now they were going nowhere. The first tremor was felt in the world's financial capitals, in the cold, glass towers. The price of Brent crude, the global benchmark, had been trading at a relatively stable $65 a barrel before the crisis. It spiked past $118 in a matter of days. On trading screens, the jagged line representing the price looked less like a graph and more like a cliff face. Analysts from Goldman Sachs and Bernstein issued frantic notes to clients. The numbers they projected were terrifying. The stock markets convulsed in response. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell by over 1,000 points in a single session. It was a tremor, a warning shock. But the real earthquake was still traveling through the system, moving at the speed of a laden supertanker. Now, consider what else was trapped in that queue. It was not just crude oil. The Strait of Hormuz is a conduit for everything that fuels and fertilizes the modern world. It carries 20% of all global liquefied natural gas exports. The majority of it from the tiny, towering production platforms of Qatar. It carries 1/3 of the world's seaborne fertilizer trade. The compounds that grow the food that feeds billions. It carries 30% of Europe's jet fuel supply, the lifeblood of its aviation industry. The blockade was not merely an energy crisis. It was a compound fracture of global supply chains. And the pain was not distributed evenly. It landed with devastating precision on the nations least able to bear it. In South Asia, the lights began to flicker. Pakistan imports 99% of its liquefied natural gas. Bangladesh relies on the strait for 72% of its LNG. India, a rising economic giant, depends on it for 53%. For these countries, gas is not a luxury for heating homes. It's the primary fuel for power generation, for industry. Within a week of the blockade, rolling blackouts began in Karachi, factories ground to a halt. Governments declared states of emergency, but surely, you might think, the world has backup plans. There are other routes. This is where the geography becomes a prison. The Persian Gulf is a nearly closed sea. Almost all of its exports must funnel through that one narrow gate. There are only 2 significant pipelines that can bypass the Strait of Hormuz. Saudi Arabia's Petrolin, running east to west across the vast Arabian desert to the port of Yanbu on the Red Sea, can carry about 2 million barrels per day. The United Arab Emirates, which runs from the oil fields to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, outside the strait, combined, they offer a lifeline of 2.6 million barrels per day. That sounds like a lot, until you remember that 20 million barrels per day have just been switched off. The math is brutal and inescapable. The bypass capacity handles only 13% of the blocked flow. 87% of that daily torrent has nowhere else to go. The world's strategic petroleum reserves, held by nations in underground salt caverns, became the only buffer against total collapse. The International Energy Agency, headquartered in Paris, their models, however, were clear. The global stockpile could only cushion the blow for so long. And this is only the beginning, because the crisis immediately created a new parallel economy of risk and fear. The moment the IRGC made its declaration, the world's maritime insurance markets went into cardiac arrest. War risk insurance premiums for vessels, which had been a negligible 0.2% of a ship's value, exploded to 1% almost overnight. For a $200 million supertanker, that meant an extra $2 million in premium for a single voyage. But many underwriters simply refused to offer coverage at any price. The calculus of risk had broken. Faced with this, the titans of global shipping, one by one, they announced a full suspension of transit through the Strait of Hormuz. The announcements came in swift succession from Copenhagen. From Geneva, Maersk Mediterranean Shipping Company, CMACGM, Hapag-Lloyd, COSCO. Their decision was not political. It was financial. A cold assessment that the risk of losing a $500 million ship and its crew, the strait did not just close by military order. It closed by the invisible hand of the market had slammed a door shut. Now, pause on that for a moment. The world has lost 20% of its daily oil supply. The financial markets are in panic. The shipping industry is frozen. What happens next is not a single event, but a cascade. A domino fall of consequences that ripples into every corner of daily life. This is where the abstract numbers on a trading screen become the price of bread, cost of a plane ticket, the layoff notice. Former White House Energy Advisor Bob McNally, who lived through the oil shocks of the past, framed it with stark clarity. A prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz, he stated publicly, is a guaranteed global recession. The modeling firms and investment banks began to put numbers to that guarantee. The probability of a severe recession in Europe and Japan was estimated at 70% or higher. For the United States, it was estimated at 50%. Economists at institutions like the International Monetary Fund, a 3-month closure, they found, could trigger global GDP contractions of 1.5 to 3%. That may sound like a small number, but in a world economy valued in the tens of trillions of dollars, a 3% contraction represents trillions in lost output, millions of lost jobs. This was no longer a story about oil tankers. It was a story about the fragility of everything we have built. Let us follow one of those cascading consequences, the one that strikes at the most fundamental human need: food. The fertilizer trade blocked in the strait is a critical input for global agriculture. Natural gas is the primary feedstock for nitrogen-based fertilizers. With Qatar's LNG exports trapped, and with natural gas prices soaring worldwide, fertilizer plants from Europe to Asia began to slow production. The price of urea, a common nitrogen fertilizer, farmers from the American Midwest to the Punjab of India faced a horrible choice: pay the exorbitant new prices and go bankrupt, or cut application rates and watch their yields plummet. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization issued a warning of a looming global food price crisis, an echo of the 2007 and 2008 food riots. But this time, the trigger, it was a deliberate act of geopolitical conflict in a narrow waterway halfway across the world. The breadbaskets of the world were now hostage to the Strait of Hormuz. And here's the part that reshapes the global order. The crisis exposed with brutal clarity the deep fault lines between allies and the desperate scrambles for survival. In Europe, governments that had spent years championing a green transition suddenly found themselves frantically searching for any source of fossil fuels. Plans to phase out coal were quietly shelved as German and Polish power plants fired up old lignite mines. The diplomatic unity of the West was strained to its breaking point. The United States, having participated in the strike that sparked the crisis, pushed for a forceful naval response to reopen the strait, a dangerous proposition that risked a full-scale war with Iran. France and Germany, utterly dependent on that seaborne energy, publicly urged extreme caution. Meanwhile, China, the world's largest oil importer, while it had diversified its sources over the years, a significant portion of its crude still came from the Gulf. Beijing launched a frenetic diplomatic offensive, but its primary focus was clear: secure its own supply chains at any cost. The concept of globalization fractured into a raw, but to truly understand the human dimension, you must look away from the corridors of power and look instead to a port city like Fujairah in the United Arab Emirates. Before the crisis, Fujairah was a bustling hub, a place where the bypass pipeline from Abu Dhabi fed tankers in a safer anchorage outside the Gulf. Now, it became a scene of surreal congestion. The anchorage swelled far beyond capacity, a floating forest of steel masts and hulls so dense that from the air you could barely see the water. Onshore, hotels were overbooked with stranded sailors and anxious shipping executives. The air smelled of salt, diesel, and desperation. On one of those crude tankers, in a satellite phone interview with the trade publication Lloyd's List, described the eerie atmosphere. "We are floating prisons of expensive cargo. We play cards. We watch the same movies. We look at the Iranian coastline through binoculars. We wait. The company tells us to wait. No one knows for how long. Every day, the cost is in the millions. And every day, the world gets a little bit hungrier." His voice, crackling over the satellite link, held the weight of the entire stalled system. That waiting could not last forever. The global economy is a complex machine, but it is not infinitely resilient. As the weeks of the blockade stretched into a month, the pressure became intolerable. The strategic petroleum reserves were being drained. In emerging economies, the blackouts grew longer. The pressure points were everywhere. The question was no longer if the crisis would break, but what would break first. Would it be the political will of the Iranian regime, facing internal dissent? Would it be the military resolve of a United States-led coalition, assembling a fleet off the coast of Oman in a show of force reminiscent of the tanker war of the 1980s? Or would it be the global economy itself, buckling under the strain and plunging into a depression that would make 2008 look like a mild downturn? Each path led into uncharted and dangerous territory. A negotiated reopening would leave the world forever aware of its vulnerability, likely triggering a frantic and expensive diversification away from the Gulf. A military reopening risked a regional conflagration that could set the world's oil fields ablaze, and an economic collapse would rewrite the rules of power and poverty for a generation. We stand at that precipice. The Strait of Hormuz Crisis of 2026 is more than a news event. It is a stress test for the entire architecture of the modern world. It proves that our prosperity is built on a foundation of constant motion, on the assumption that a few narrow passages on the map will remain forever open. It proves that the delicate balance of global trade can be shattered by a single act in a single place. The legacy of this crisis will be a world that is more expensive, more volatile, and more divided. The age of cheap and abundant energy, the engine of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, may have ended not with a gradual transition, but with a sudden violent chokehold in the waters between Iran and Oman. The tankers are still waiting. The lights are still flickering, and the lesson is being written in the language of price shocks, recession models, and human desperation. It is a lesson in dependency. It is a lesson, and it is a lesson we are only just beginning to learn. The story does not end with a treaty signed or a ship sailing through. It ends with a permanent scar on the global consciousness. The number 20 million barrels per day is no longer a statistic. It is spectre. The name Hormuz is no longer just a geographic feature. It is a synonym for systemic risk. In boardrooms and government ministries, a new question now dominates long-term planning. What happens when the chokepoint closes again? The race for alternatives, renewables, new pipelines across impossible terrain, Arctic shipping routes. But for the billions of people whose lives were disrupted, the memory will be more visceral. The darkness during a blackout in Lahore, the empty shelf where fertilizer should be in Nairobi, the silent factory gate in Wuhan. The crisis demonstrated that in our interconnected world, a blockade is not an act of war against a single nation. It is an act of war against the everyday life of humanity itself. And in that realization lies the only hope for preventing the next. We have seen how fragile the web truly is. The question that remains is whether we have the courage and the wisdom to weave something stronger. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary, please subscribe to our channel. We bring you fascinating documentaries on history, science, civilizations. Hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so you never miss a new release. Until next time.